The Midwest in the 1940s breathed a rhythm of its own, fields rolling endlessly to the horizon, dust swirling behind tractors, and church bells marking the hours in towns too small to appear on a map. Seasons decided nearly everything. When children rose for school, when grain silos opened, when hope thinned or returned. Yet beneath that ordinary peace, a strange chapter of history was quietly unfolding. Across America's farmland, sometimes beyond a single row of trees, barbed wire gleamed under sunlight, encircling makeshift compounds filled with young men who just months earlier had fought under the banner of the Third Reich. They were soldiers of a defeated army, the German prisoners of war transported across the Atlantic to the heart of a country they had been taught to hate, a land their propaganda had painted as chaotic and cruel. Yet what awaited them was something unexpected, a vast and calm landscape that did not look like war. The skies were unbroken, the fields unscarred, and the people, farmers with sun-creased faces and steady hands, seemed to live in a world untouched by the destruction ravaging Europe. Between 1943 and 1946, more than 400,000 German POWs were held in camps scattered across the United States, from Texas plains to Minnesota forests, from the Carolinas to the deep heart of Iowa and Nebraska. What many of them could never have imagined was how familiar this new land would sound. When the trucks rolled through small rural towns, they began to hear voices calling out in their own mother tongue. German words spoken with strange accents filtered through the fences, orders shouted in fields, lullabies sung to children, prayers murmured before meals. For many of these young prisoners, it was like hearing ghosts of home. Some of the men stared in disbelief, others laughed in confusion. Who were these people? These Americans who spoke like them, who prayed like them, who even carried the same surnames carved into gravestones back in Bavaria or Hanover. In their minds, America had been an enemy shaped by film reels and battlefront stories. But here were farmers who could slip easily from English to German while working side by side with them under a hot summer sky. The irony cut deep. Many of those farmers were the descendants of German immigrants who had come to the United States generations earlier, fleeing poverty or seeking new promise in the 19th century. They had built barns, tilled forgotten soil, and established communities where the old language survived in hymns and harvest songs, even as the younger generation pledged allegiance to their new country. Yet by the 1940s that shared bloodline met again, not across dinner tables, but across a fence woven with barbed wire. War spares nothing, not even language. To the captured soldiers, the camp guards wearing American uniforms sometimes spoke with the same inflection as their own fathers. Letters home to Germany began describing this strange reality. One young prisoner wrote that the fields outside his barracks looked just like Schleswig. Another confessed he was ashamed when an American farmer offered him coffee using a dialect his grandmother had once spoken. Confusion turned to introspection. How could an enemy sound so much like family? Across the camp boundaries, quiet moments replaced hostility. Farmers short on labour during harvest asked for help from the nearby camps, and many POWs were sent under supervision to pick corn, cut wheat, or load hay bales. In those moments, surrounded by the creak of wagons and the smell of warm soil, strangers divided by war found themselves speaking the same language, both literally and spiritually. Some exchanged stories about villages they might have both known, others found traceable family names stretching across the ocean. It was as though history had folded in on itself, a collision between two versions of the German soul, one reshaped by democracy, the other hardened by dictatorship. And inside that encounter rested a truth far larger than any political boundary, that identity cannot be conquered by ideology alone. Beneath the uniforms, beneath the brief command of war, humanity always finds a way to recognize itself. Yet it was not that simple. Some Americans still viewed these prisoners with suspicion, their German language stirring old resentments from World War I. And for the POWs, every note of kindness brought both comfort and guilt. How could they accept decency from those they had once sworn to defeat? How could one reconcile the hospitality of strangers with the ashes of cities left behind? Every shared word, every repaired fence post tested their certainty about who stood on the right side of justice. By 1945, as victory neared, those camps became unlikely classrooms of transformation. Not only were the prisoners changed by America, they were also mirrors revealing what America itself had become. A nation that could imprison its enemies yet still offer them dignity, a country aware of its own contradictions. Inside muslin tents and wooden barracks, ideological worlds clashed quietly, far from any battlefield. Outside, autumn gathered over the fields. Leaves fell in colours borrowed from European forests, and the air carried both the sweetness of promise and the heaviness of memory. The war was ending, but something more enduring had begun, an understanding whispered in both English and German. In the dance of two histories meeting again, enemies would share bread, stories, and seeds for forgiveness that would outlive their generation. This is the story of that encounter, how the soil of America became a stage for irony, revelation, and reconciliation. It is a story of how language bridged what war tried to destroy, a story told in prayers whispered across fences, and in the stunned faces of prisoners who realized that even in captivity they had somehow come home. But that was only the beginning of a far deeper awakening, one that would blur the lines between victor and captive, between foreign and familiar, between guilt and grace. By the spring of 1944, the war had crossed oceans and taken new shape. In Europe, towns smouldered. In America, factories thundered with production, planes, boots, ammunition, food for armies scattered across the world. But behind that noise, across the quiet prairies, something unexpected was happening. Convoys of trucks with white stars on their doors were rolling through tiny country roads, bringing young men who had once been the enemy to places that seemed untouched by the war they had lost. The first German prisoners arrived in America under heavy guard, eyes hollow from weeks at sea. They expected punishment, maybe even brutality. Instead, they were met with fields, corn stretching to the horizon, red barns, white farmhouses, and the slow hum of tractors in the afternoon heat. Behind the fences, their barracks looked out on rows of grain shimmering in sunlight, a strange sight for men who had come from bomb-scarred Europe. Many of them could not believe that a nation at war could look so peaceful, but the real shock came not from what they saw, but what they heard. In the camp kitchens, in the markets, in the fields where they were sent to work, the air occasionally filled with words they recognized. Guten Morgen, wie geht's? Pass off. At first, they thought the guards were mocking them. Then they realized the voices came from beyond the fences, from the farmers themselves. The accents were older, softer, but unmistakably German. For a moment, it felt as though the war had folded the map of the world back on itself, bringing home to a place far away from home. Many of these farmers were descendants of immigrants who had left Germany generations earlier. They had carried their language like a keepsake, using it in church hymns and family gatherings, preserving it in places like Wisconsin, Nebraska, and Texas Hill Country. These were communities where dialects from the Rhineland or Swabia had survived long after fading from European villages. To the POWs, it was haunting, proof that the language of Goethe and Schiller, the language that had raised both poets and tyrants, could sound gentle again. They worked long hours under the same sun. The prisoners cut alfalfa, picked fruit, and drove tractors alongside Americans who, apart from a uniform and a rifle nearby, were not very different from them. Some even shared family names. A farmer in Iowa realized his new laborer came from the same small region his grandfather had once called home. The young prisoner's face brightened when he heard it. They traced their ancestry back to the same river valley, divided now by ideology, but bound by blood older than any nation's flag. Within fences meant to separate, language began to unite. Prisoners taught a few German words to American children who peered curiously through the wire, and the farmers' wives sometimes left extra food by the fence, wrapped plainly, unspoken. Conversations grew longer. Trust in small gestures returned. Guards often reported that discipline was easier in these camps than anywhere else. Perhaps because the prisoners no longer felt completely alien here. Perhaps because for the first time in years they were treated as men rather than enemies. Still, the situation carried tension. Inside barracks, loyalty to the old cause remained strong for some. Heated debates spread among the POWs. Those who clung to Hitler's fading promise argued bitterly with others worn down by defeat and doubt. Nighttime sometimes echoed with songs in two tones, defiance in one corner, remorse in another. But the longer they worked beside the farmers, the harder it became for those illusions to survive. They saw churches filled with German-speaking families praying not for victory, but for peace. They saw freedom existing without fear and labour unchained from slogans. Many of them began to question what they truly believed in. For the Americans too, there was quiet unease. The memory of 2 wars fought against Germany was not easy to forget. Some locals protested the POW camps, fearing the enemy's presence, suspecting sabotage or escape. But as months passed, the farmers' attitudes transformed. They needed help. War had pulled millions of young Americans overseas, leaving families struggling to harvest their crops, and in that need, humanity revealed itself. They began to see these prisoners not as monsters, but as sons and brothers shaped by another fate. One veteran farmer, a widower named Henry Becker from Kansas, later recalled how a young German named Karl asked him one day, in hesitant English, why he kept letting them work without watching over their every move. Henry had looked up from the hay bales and answered simply, "Because somebody's watching over you already, and it's not me." The boy nodded slowly. Trust, fragile but real, took root. Letters began to travel, first censored and simple, then more honest. Prisoners wrote to families back home describing the unimaginable courtesy of their captors. "They speak our language here," one letter read, "and sometimes, for a moment, I forget we are prisoners." Some confessed confusion. How a system built around freedom could be so strong, while the empire they had fought for promised greatness yet brought only ruin. By 1945, the war was turning irrevocably against Germany, and news of defeat rippled through the camps. The compound radios carried muffled reports of Berlin's downfall. Some prisoners wept, others felt only numbness. But outside the fences, American life continued. Tractors still moved through the fields, wind carried the smell of rain, and the German words of American farmers still filled the air with unexpected warmth. The contrast was unbearable and revealing. When the war finally ended, hundreds of thousands of POWs prepared to return home. Farewell was not easy. Farmers who had once feared them now shook their hands, sometimes embraced them. Photographs were taken, young men in faded uniforms standing beside families in overalls and Sunday dresses. Bread was broken, addresses exchanged, promises made. Some of those connections would outlive the war. Years later, letters travelled back across the Atlantic, letters of gratitude, friendship, even forgiveness. Yet the end of captivity did not mean the end of reckoning. Returning to Germany, many former POWs faced cities reduced to ash, nations divided, and ideals dismantled. But in their memory, somewhere deep within, they carried something gentler. The sound of German words spoken freely in a place where freedom itself had survived. The sight of Midwestern farms where enemies had worked side by side under endless skies. And for some, it became the seed of a new belief, that identity could be rescued from ideology, and that even language, once twisted by hatred, could become a bridge again. In later decades, historians would call these camps schools for democracy, not because lessons were taught in classrooms, but because they were lived in fields and shared meals. Many former POWs went on to help rebuild Germany's post-war society, with that memory guiding them, the strange proof that decency could be stronger than propaganda. In interviews recorded long after, one recalled, "I came to America as a soldier. I left as a man who had met his better self." And across rural America, the memory lingered too. For the families who remembered those days, it became a quiet legacy. Proof that compassion does not weaken a nation, it defines it. The fences came down, the prisoners departed, but sometimes at night when wind passed over the cornfields, an older farmer could still swear he heard familiar words carried on the air. Gute Nacht, good night. It was a farewell that stretched beyond war, a farewell between two versions of the same people, once divided, now intertwined by memory. In the silence that remained, under wide and forgiving skies, America and Germany were no longer distant strangers. They were bound by something deeper than defeat or victory, the shared recognition of what it means to lose one's way and to find it again through another's mercy. But as the trains carried the prisoners away and peace settled uneasily over the world, a question endured, whether the past could ever be buried by gratitude, or whether it would rise again in another time wearing another name. The passing of years has softened the edges of that story, but time cannot erase its echo. Across the plains where barbed wire once glinted in the sun, only wind moves now, soft and tireless, through endless rows of grain. The fences have vanished, the barracks long dismantled. Yet if you walk the fields at dawn, when the light is tender and the soil still remembers footprints long faded, you might feel the faint hum of what once happened here. The meeting of two worlds, divided by war but joined by something older than politics, the simple recognition of human kinship. For the young German prisoners who were brought to America, the experience was something between exile and revelation. They had been raised in a nation that worshipped strength and obedience, where compassion was often seen as weakness. But in the fields of Iowa, Texas, Nebraska, they saw a different sort of strength, the quiet endurance of farmers who ploughed their land each morning not for conquest, but for life itself. They saw people who spoke the same language, not for empire but for prayer, who sang in the same tones their mothers once used, not triumphal marches but lullabies. When those men returned to Germany after the war, they carried home more than memories of captivity. They carried something that cannot be counted in statistics or medals, a vision of dignity restored through human decency. Many later said that the encounter with American farmers had pressed them to question the lies that had raised them. Others simply remembered the kindness of strangers who had no reason to be kind. In a time when nations defined themselves by enemies, they discovered a grace that crossed every border. History seldom remembers such quiet moments. The grand narratives speak of victories, treaties, and ruins. But history's pulse often beats in the smallest acts. A shared cup of coffee passed through a fence, a word of comfort murmured in a common tongue. These gestures left no monuments, but they reshaped more lives than the noise of war ever could. For the farmers, too, there was a change, not through triumph, but through intimacy. They saw in their prisoners' faces a reflection of their own ancestors, men who had fled hunger and tyranny searching for a better life. The war had made enemies of kin. The soil reminded them they had once been family. Decades later, when the archives opened and interviews were recorded, both sides spoke with nostalgia, not bitterness. A former POW named Wilhelm once recalled working beside a farmer who recited the Lord's Prayer in German. For him, it was as if language itself had turned from the weapon to bridge. That day, he said, I stopped believing in enemies. In that humble confession lies the essence of what those years taught the world, that humanity cannot be conquered by fear, nor can language belong to cruelty forever. Consider what it meant for America too, a nation founded by immigrants, forged in conflicting identities, recognized a reflection of itself in those who had come as captives. It discovered that mercy could coexist with strength, and that faith in decency was not weakness, but endurance. In those years, the United States became not only a fortress of the industry, but a quiet teacher of reconciliation. Not through proclamations, but through the everyday rhythm of harvests shared between enemies who, under open skies, remembered what it meant simply to be men. The irony of German words heard in American fields carried more than surprise. It carried a warning for generations to come. It showed that identities can divide, but they can also return to their source, where understanding begins. It questioned the idea of superiority that had fueled so much suffering, reminding both victor and vanquished that the boundaries we draw between ourselves are fragile and absurd when set against the vast, forgiving landscape of the human spirit. Now, nearly a century later, that irony still breathes. In small towns across the Midwest, old churches still carry songs in German. Famous names carved into stone still bear the same letters once seen in European villages. And somewhere in those lines of heritage, history continues to whisper that in the heartlands of a young and hopeful America, the echoes of another homeland found a second life. Standing on that soil today, it is easy to forget that it once held men who had fought one another to exhaustion. But listen long enough, and the wind still carries fragments of their voices, laughter mixing with labour, stories told between rows of corn, the cadence of two languages finding harmony. Those were not moments of peace dictated by treaties. They were moments of peace discovered through understanding. And they endure precisely because they were fragile. What those German POWs discovered among the farmers of America was not just hospitality. It was redemption through recognition. They had come expecting hatred and found humility. They had come expecting vengeance and found welcome. The simplicity of that truth remains more powerful than any lecture in diplomacy. Hatred thrives on distance, but disappears in proximity. When we work beside one another, when we share food, when we speak, even awkwardly, the same words, the illusion of difference begins to fade. In time, every war leaves behind two legacies, the ruins that crumble and the stories that survive. The first belongs to memory, the second to hope. The story of German prisoners hearing their own language in the heart of America belongs to the second kind. It reminds us that even in the bleakest chapters, empathy can find its voice, speaking quietly beneath the noise of history. And perhaps that is what keeps civilizations from repeating their worst mistakes, the gentle insistence that understanding can exist among those who are told to despise each other. If you were to stand under the vast sky of Kansas or the open plains of Minnesota at dusk, where the horizon stretches until it breaks into light, you might still feel what those men felt, the strangeness of being far from home yet somehow close to it. That feeling is the heart of this story. Displacement transformed into connection, captivity turning into comprehension. It is the moment when history hesitates and humanity begins to speak. And so, the journey comes full circle. German prisoners who once marched into captivity left this land changed, by kindness, by irony, by the rediscovery of their own language as a tool for peace. The American farmers who welcomed them learned in turn that compassion, even toward an enemy, enriches the soil of a nation. Their brief encounter became an unwritten treaty between hearts, teaching that identity need not divide, and forgiveness need not wait for permission. The fields remain, the sky remains, and somewhere within that endless expanse the memory remains too. Quiet, resilient, enduring. It is the voice of history reminding us that what defines a people is not the wars they win, but the mercy they choose. Time may wash away the footprints of those men, but their lesson endures, that even across fences and flags we speak the same language when we choose to understand. The war ended long ago, but its truest victory was whispered, not marched, in the fields where enemies once worked side by side beneath the same forgiving sun.